Western Caucus Foundation. Welcome to our Digital Connect seminar on 30 by 30. We are here to discuss this new proposal by the administration that would put 30% of the nation's land into conservation by 2030, quote unquote, to protect biodiversity. Many have been advocating that undeveloped land has been and is disappearing. However, the reality regarding U.S. lands, habitat, and wildlife is quite different, and we're going to talk about that today. Ironically, governments already own over a third of the nation and has regulations applicable to millions of private acres. So questioning why we're doing this type of conservation project. That said, we have a great panel of speakers here to discuss the potential impact of 30 by 30. We'll also highlight the Western Caucus's conservation principles, a common sense alternative to 30 by 30. And with that, we'll kick it off with our Senate Western Caucus Chairman, Senator Steve Daines from Montana.
Carol, thanks. And thanks to our speakers for coming out to discuss the Biden administration's 30 by 30 initiative's impact on the West. I got to tell you, a 30-30 is a great rifle. It's not a great initiative from the White House, as this guy's view anyway from Montana. It's been over a year since President Biden signed this executive order that's kickstarting this initiative, but unfortunately, we don't know any more now than we did then. The administration has called to place 30% of our lands and waters in an undefined conservation status by 2030, but will not answer a few really important questions. How do they define conservation? How many acres are already conserved? And how do they plan to carry this out? Now, I can guarantee you nobody on this webinar today is against conservation. I'm an active outdoorsman. I can probably talk high country mountain lakes in the Beartooth Wilderness better than most Sierra Club members can. I've been called a conservative conservationist by one of my papers back home. I helped champion one of the great conservation victories in the last 50 years when we passed the Great American Outdoors Act. So let's be clear. I support conservation. I think everybody here supports conservation. But the lack of information and this subjective, ambiguous terms the administration is relying on leads Montanans and Westerners to fear the worst, as we should. The administration has done nothing to reassure the public that their 30 by 30 initiative isn't just a guise to restrict use or access on public lands. In fact, the 30 by 30 progress report highlighted actions taken by the Department of the Interior and Agriculture to lock up land through preservation-focused designations, oftentimes without the support of local communities. Now, the administration is proposing to develop a nationwide inventory of lands and waters meeting their preservationist standard. Let's be clear. They do not have the authorization or the funding from Congress to do this. And they have provided no certainty that private property rights will be respected in this process. Our timber companies, our sportsmen, our ranchers, our energy and mineral companies all play an important role in conservation on our public lands, and they do have a great story to tell. But this divisive rhetoric and the policies are alienating these partners instead of bringing them to the table. Conservation should be something that brings us together. Westerners take pride in stewarding our lands, our resources, our wildlife for generations to come. And that's why I partnered with Chairman Newhouse in proposing our alternative to the 30 by 30 initiative, the Western Conservation Principles. This document detailed the Western Caucus's conservation agenda, stressing that multiple use and even development is compatible with conservation. The Western Conservation Principles called on the administration to refocus efforts on the vast management needs on our public lands, not private lands. We urge the administration to pursue healthier landscapes, not ambiguous land status that do not necessarily reflect conservation happening on our landscapes. So we're calling for increased forest management, that's stewardship, more flexibilities and certainty for public land grazing, responsible, all the above energy development. For heaven's sakes, let's watch what's happened here with the invasion of Ukraine. I hope we can wake some of those folks up. Some of these woke folks suddenly become awake about the importance of keeping an all the above energy portfolio. I like what Secretary Bruyette said in one of our past panels, Daryl, when he said we should think about it, renewables is expanding our portfolio, adding to the portfolio, not substituting for other parts of the portfolio. I think that's wise. And hopefully the Russians have awakened the world in the importance of energy independence and having America be the dominating leader in energy. And by the way, we can accomplish this through time-tested policies, streamlining bureaucratic processes, increasing the state's role in species recovery, leveraging these private partnerships, and providing relief from, God help us all, this frivolous litigation that's happening across our country. Western conservation principles has a support of groups across the spectrum, from the Nature Conservancy to the National Mining Association. I'd call that pretty bipartisan. This is the approach we need to accomplish meaningful conservation on the ground. So with that, if Chairman Newhouse is back from the votes, I'll turn it over to him. If not, Daryl, we can see where we want to go next, or we want to go to the speakers or so.
Okay, I think we have them running back from votes. I don't see them on, so we're waiting on Dan Newhouse and Chris Stewart from Utah. But in the meantime, I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Sheffield from the National Association of Counties. He handles the Western portfolio for the counties, and he's got some exciting information to provide us on what they're doing and their support for the Western Caucus principles.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you to Chairman Daines, Chairman Newhouse, and the rest of the Western Caucus membership and my fellow panelists today. It's always nice to be back with the Western Caucus. Having been a former executive director, it's always a good homecoming whenever I'm invited by Daryl and the rest of the crew to join you, so thank you. As I'm sure most of the folks listening to know, many county authorities and responsibilities are mandated by both federal or state laws and regulations. And that includes in the realm of conservation policy. And as co-regulators and environmental stewards, we have a keen interest in all aspects of resource management policy. The America the Beautiful initiative, or 30 by 30 as it's also known, caused a lot of concerns, especially with our Western members when it was initially introduced. Western counties, some of which are over 90% federally owned, are concerned that this could be used as a means to acquire more federal land, restrict access to the public, or greatly increase resource and water ownership. We've met with the administration multiple times on this issue, and we definitely appreciate the outreach and the time that they've shown to us to listen to our concerns, ideas, and questions. We even set up a special comment session for county officials to discuss 30 by 30 and the Conservation Atlas with USDA, DOI, and CEQ at our legislative conference in DC back in February. And again, while those dialogues have been constructive, as Senator Daines said in his opening remarks, after 1 year, we still don't have answers to some of our biggest questions. And I think for our members, the biggest one is, what is the definition of conservation that they're aiming for? We've asked this question in every meeting and in every piece of written correspondence with the administration on this subject, including in our written comments on the Conservation Atlas last month. We've not received any kind of a final answer, as I know the members of Congress have not. But I can say that administration officials continue to insist that the definition must be flexible. That's their term, not mine, but flexible. But until we see a definition, it's impossible to judge exactly where this is going to go. And while we agree the definition needs to be flexible, conservation includes a broad array of practices, as the senator laid out. It's everything from protecting pristine wilderness areas to treating our federal forests to prevent wildfires. And it also encompasses those working lands that provide the fiber, fuel, and food that keep the economy going. So therefore, at our legislative conference last month, NACO endorsed the Western Conservation Principles document through an interim resolution. And this resolution encourages the Biden administration and the Congress to use these principles as the definition of conservation in developing the America the Beautiful initiative and in the development of the Conservation Atlas. The principles, of course, call on the administration to focus on sound scientific management of our public lands and incorporate all levels of government and impacted stakeholders into resource management decisions. Conservation must be a holistic approach and based on the needs of the local economy and the environment. These decisions will be made best when they're made from the ground up and not the top down from Washington. 30 by 30 should also be focused on provable results and not just feel good messaging. The Western Conservation Principles document would push the America the Beautiful initiative toward beneficial outcomes and provable results and not just nice talking points. It also tackles a big list of topics that the senator laid out, including cleaning up abandoned mines and wells and other toxic sites, reducing checkerboarding on public lands so that access is consistent across the board, promoting forest health and other really important matters to improve landscapes and watersheds in the West. We fully support the caucus's push for expanded good neighbor authority and stewardship contracting as well, which are laid out in the document. And we call on Congress to extend receipt sharing to counties and tribes so that we can retain and reinvest those receipts to do more restoration work on and off federal lands. So in wrapping up, I just want to say thank you again to the caucus for their continuous support for Western counties, not only through the development of the principles document, but just over the years and all the work that we've been able to do together. If the administration truly wants to know how to implement conservation policy with the most buy-in from impacted communities, the Western Caucus drew them a really good roadmap, which lays out the definition of conservation that Gifford Pinchot defined. And that is the wise use of the earth and its resources for the lasting good of men. We encourage the administration and Congress to embrace the conservation principles and to use these as our guideposts as we implement conservation strategy moving forward. So with that, Daryl and everybody else on the team, again, just thanks for the opportunity, and I'll turn it back over to you.
I'm sure Senator Daines is thrilled to hear what you just said, and I just want to clarify. So this is your position from NACO, is that the administration should use the Western Caucus principles as the definition for conservation and the guideposts for their 30 by 30 initiative.
That's correct, yes.
Well, Jonathan, we're going to run you for president of the United States in 2024. So good work.
I'm just old enough, so good.
Okay, good. Well, hey, I tell you, be careful. I really appreciate that. That means a lot, because I just will say this, that when I look at trying to get I think the best voice that's most in tune with the people back home, I look at our counties and county commissioners, and I think they balance the politics and the policies as well as anybody in the, navigating through some of these policies. So anyway, that means a lot.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, it looks like we have our esteemed Congressional Caucus Chairman, Western Caucus Chairman, Mr. Dan Newhouse from Washington. We just had Jonathan Sheffield talk about their county's position and their adoption of the Western Caucus conservation principles as their guidepost for what the administration should do on 30 by 30. I know you have some comments and opening stuff, so I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate that, Daryl, and I want to thank everybody for being part of this today. And I'm very proud to be hosting this discussion and being able to be part of it as well. So apologize for votes going on. But this issue, as you know, is a huge priority for the Western Caucus and the districts that we represent across the country. So yeah, I do have a few comments. I'd like to start by saying, just this week, President Biden released the outline of his budget, as you all know, and it is clear that his approach to conservation remains misguided. His administration continues to increase spending to tackle climate change. But instead of throwing money at this nebulous issue, he should be listening to those of us who are on the ground throughout the Western United States and across the country. Those people whose livelihoods depend on a healthy ecosystem, on clean air and clean water, on well-managed land, and those who are the ones who have actually brought forth solutions to support our local environments. Rural communities understand that in order to protect our natural resources, we've got to manage it. And we know conservation and working lands go hand in hand. This notion set forth by the administration that we need to put 30% of our lands under a protected status by the year 2030. Well, let's be clear, that's exactly what they mean, is not only founded upon a false pretense of what conservation means, but it's truly unfair to those men and women that I just mentioned, those in the local communities who've been working, in some cases, their whole lives to ensure a healthy environment for our communities and for wildlife. That's why Western Caucus members put together the Western Conservation Principles, which is our blueprint for the definition of what true, real conservation is. From fulfilling the federal government's multi-use mandate in ensuring safe and responsible energy development on public lands to supporting resilient federal forests and grasslands through active management and efficiently protecting endangered and threatened species. These principles are founded on the values and those practices that are already in use throughout rural America. And our advocacy on behalf of our communities, I think, is more important now than ever. We've seen the negative impacts of the administration's preservationist approach by locking away our lands, literally under lock and key. They have paved the way for catastrophic wildfires and historic drought conditions. And they've ignored the voices of local communities and tribes who no longer have access to some of our nation's most treasured landscapes and resource-rich areas. I know we'll hear more of that perspective as we continue today, both about the administration's misguided proposals and also about the importance of empowering real conservation in states and communities. I'm particularly glad to hear from Jonathan with his update on behalf of the nation's counties that they are embracing our Western conservation principles. That's just awesome. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today, and I look forward to a really good discussion. And now I think I'd like to introduce our next guest. Daryl, is Mr. Stewart with us yet?
I don't see him online yet, so.
Well, I'll give a word of introduction when he does show up. But thank you all very much for being part of this very important discussion. Senator Daines, thank you as well.
Thanks, Chairman Newhouse.
Great. Now, well, we're waiting for Mr. Stewart to arrive as well. Heath Hecla, Director of Government Affairs for the American Forest Research Council. Welcome back to Western Caucus events. Thank you for joining us. You are still muted. You are still muted.
How about that?
There we go.
Sorry about that. Okay, well, don't know what happened there. Anyways, thank you for the invitation, Daryl, and thank you, Chairman Daines and Newhouse, for your efforts on behalf of forest health. I don't think anything outlines the difference between the conservation principles that the Western Caucus has put forward and the alternative than the situation we're seeing on our national forests. We have a federal forest health crisis across the West. Senator Daines is well aware of this, as is Congressman Newhouse, with 10 million acres burning in 2020, over 7 million in 2021. And we've seen the results of, really a hands-off approach completely to our forests as harvest levels have decreased and thinning and proactive management. We've seen mortality increase, wildfires, and frankly, carbon emissions that have come out that have, obviously smoke that is devastating our communities each summer. The national forest system is the crown jewel out there, 193 million acres, established really at the principle that Jonathan mentioned originally by Gifford Pinchot, to provide multiple use, including wood products to our nation. It's guided by the National Forest Management Act, so we know we have common sense plans. But across the system, 37 million acres have been designated as wilderness, 60 million acres restricted under the 2000 2001 roadless rule. We now have 63 million acres at a high or very high risk of wildfire, 80 million acres in need of restoration, and the Forest Service hopes to treat 20 million acres additional in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, our current treatment levels are far short of what we need to get ahead of the problem. 2018, the Forest Service reported 3 million acres in treatment, but over 2 million acres of that was actually fires that they either let burn or prescribed fire, which can be helpful, but very little are we seeing the kind of proactive management we need out there. Meanwhile, we're not reforesting. We have a huge backlog, 7 million acres of reforestation on our national forest system. Finally, we're importing 30% of our softwood lumber from other countries, despite having some of the richest forest reserves in the entire world. And we know there's huge carbon benefits of forest management as well. If you look at just the 26% of the national forest system that's open to forest management, ongoing forest management, the role that it could play in sequestering carbon in wood products and through the avoidance of wildfire and emissions is absolutely huge. And as you can see on the graph on the right, both of these produced by the Forest Service, you can see the carbon benefits of wood products and managing our public lands in a sustainable and conservation-based manner. Congress is taking action, but more needs to be done. We thank Senator Daines and Congressman Newhouse and others for enacting new authorities. The Forest Service has been handed, $6 billion to try to get ahead of the problem. Unfortunately, more needs to be done. And we are seeing at the same time proposals in Congress to set aside more lands as wilderness or wild and scenic, which again restricts the ability to do thinning and the other kind of science-based management we most need to reduce the risk of wildfire to our communities and to habitat. And finally, I want to mention one bill in particular that we're tracking, which is the so-called River Democracy Act in Oregon, which would designate 4,700 miles under the Wild and Scenic Act, which corresponds to 3 million acres of Forest Service and BLM lands that would be overlaid. 75% of those are at a moderate to very high risk of wildfire. And these are just a few pictures of the kinds of areas that have been proposed for designation, which are by no means wild and scenic rivers. In fact, they're dry gulches. So the message here is we are all about protecting the acres that need to be protected, but we need to also be able to use science-based management, and your conservation principles do a really good job of supporting that. So thank you for the opportunity.
Terrific. Thank you for your comments and that quick informative presentation. That was terrific. Chairman Newhouse, we've been joined by Congressman Stewart. Would you like to introduce him?
I certainly would love to do that. We are pleased to have one of my vice chairmen in the Congressional Western Caucus, and my colleague from the great state of Utah and good friend, Mr. Chris Stewart. Happy to have you with us, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hey, Dan, it's great to be with you. Thanks for your leadership as chairman of the Western Caucus, and to Steve Daines, another good friend of mine. Steve and I came to Congress together and served for, I think, just 1 or 2 terms. And then, of course, Steve went up to be Senate and join us on the other side of the House. 1 second, if I could. So I would just say this. Much has already been said, and so I'll be brief. There's this presumption that if you're a Republican, you don't care about conservation, you don't care about pollution, you don't care about climate change, you don't care about any of these issues. It's just nonsense for someone to say that. And there's a reason I live in Utah. I love to ski, I love to rock climb, I love to sit on my back porch and just look at the mountains. And those of us who live in these beautiful spots, we certainly want to protect it. And I know that that's one of the main purposes of Western Caucus, but we also want to take advantage of the resources and the beauty in tourism, and whether it's in, having a thriving timber industry, all of these things. And you can do both. You can do all of them if you do it carefully. The 30 by 30 rule is an aspirational goal. but it's really meaningless without any details to it. And as we've seen from the administration, they have no idea how they're going to implement it. But I'll tell you this, how much more federal land can you take in the state of Utah? How much more land can you take in Western states? Gosh, we'd be thrilled to be only 30%. As I think many of you know, and certainly people from the West do, I mean, approximately 23% of the land in Utah already has the very highest level of protection. And then something like another 48% is BLM or Forest Service land. So, I mean, if we're going to do this fairly, then I think Utah's certainly done their share. And it's the people in my state and in the Western regions, they feel like they've done their share. And they don't want to have the economic impacts of having more and more of their federal lands taken from them. So, Dan, thanks for your leadership. Thanks for everyone who's online here. And I won't elaborate because much of what I would say has already been said. I just appreciate everyone who's participating and cares about these issues.
Thank you, Congressman Stewart. Senator Daines, and if you have a comment before we go on to our next speaker.
Say again.
Saying, Senator Daines, if I know if you had a comment before.
Well, first of all, Chris, it's great to have you on this this discussion today. It's good seeing you. And yeah, we did serve together for a term. We're actually related through marriage, believe it or not. So I know Chris well. But Chris, I agree with your comments. You've hit it spot on here as Republicans that we are conservation minded. Conservative is conservation. And we've got to get that message back out. What we're talking here today, I think, is true conservation. So thanks for adding those great points today.
Brother, it's good to be with you. We miss you here in the House, but I love seeing the work you're doing in the Senate. And honestly, Steve, we need a couple more in the Senate, so like you, so that we can advance some of the priorities that you're going to see coming out of the House, I think, starting in November.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
Terrific. And now we're on to our third, our final speaker of the panel, Sigurd Johans, Associate Director of the Public Lands Council. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate working with you all.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you so much to Chairman Newhouse and Chairman Daines. We really appreciate the invitation today, and we appreciate the great working relationship that PLC has had with all of you. I will also keep it brief because everybody has touched on a lot of the points that we share today, but certainly 30 by 30 we have not had a whole lot of concrete details over the past year or so since it came out, but the Public Lands Council has fully embraced this opportunity to deliver the message loud and clear and push for formal and public recognition from this administration that grazing is conservation. It might be one of the most frequently used words in Washington, but it's one of the most frequently acted on principles on ranches across the West. And that's something that we are looking for to be formalized as they move forward. Most recently, in terms of our engagement on the issue, we also submitted comments, as Jonathan touched on, for the Conservation Atlas, pushing for the differentiation between conservation and preservation, and illustrating the very clear different outcomes that you get from those two approaches, and also pushing for a greater recognition and specificity on how they plan to build on current success that we've seen on existing landscapes, rather than seeking to create new designations or new ownership patterns that don't serve those ecological goals. And certainly throughout all of this, we are keeping half an eye out to, and more than half of our voice to, pushing back on the creation of new regulatory authorities to achieve these objectives. We have said time and again in our conversations with the administration and with many lawmakers as well, this is not a goal that can be reached on paper. This is something that needs to have significant local buy-in and be led from the local level, as many of the other panelists today have touched on. And lastly, in terms of goals that we've really been pushing for and asks that we have at this point, we have been very clear that this needs to be an opportunity to address landscape level threats, not just putting a nice label on green spaces across the West. There are a myriad of challenges on the more than 640 million acres that are under federal agency management across the West. Everyone has touched on wildfire and the concerns there. We would add to that list invasive species, cheatgrass, and I don't have to tell anybody on this call about that, but there are a wide variety of ecosystem and region-specific challenges on the ground that could be a part of this initiative if the administration is willing to embrace the opportunity and put the voices of local stakeholders first. Just a few other things that I would be remiss if I didn't bring up from the grazing standpoint. We also have had many conversations with the administration, and we appreciate the engagement that everyone in this group has also had on this, of making sure that 30 by 30 is not a reason to duplicate programs that already exist. There are certainly a lot of acres enrolled in voluntary conservation programs currently. And in terms of the regulations and regulatory authorities that the administration might use to enact this goal, and also in terms of the information sharing that they are doing or not doing, we would argue is the lack of information sharing. That's something that we want to see rectified as they move forward. NRCS has already collected millions of data points on working lands, and that's something that the Department of Interior, as they develop this conservation atlas, and other agencies and other offices need to take advantage of and communicate with each other. And we appreciate the help that we've gotten in pushing for that as well. And lastly, I'll wrap up because I know everyone on this call has shared a lot of the similar thoughts, and we're certainly speaking with a unified voice. Everyone here knows, but conservation is not just happening on national parks or wild and scenic river miles. It's also happening on thousands of cattle and sheep operations across the West that PLC is proud to represent. And I would like to just echo Heath's comments, a bill that we are particularly concerned about and that we are actively discussing with our partners on Capitol Hill is the River Democracy Act. That is not a recipe for lasting conservation. It certainly plays into the wildfire conversation that everyone has touched on. And, there is that misconception that Republican members or Republican groups or Republican, thought is not in line with some of these issues. And that is just simply not true. It is not sound climate policy or ecosystem management policy to watch all of these acres go up in smoke year after year. So that is also a bill that we're terribly concerned about, but I know I don't have to point that out to anyone here. And I appreciate the opportunity to join the discussion today.
Thank you much. Turn it over to you, Chairman Daines, to kick us off on.
Sure. Well, Sigrid, you just were commenting. Since you just finished speaking, I want to throw a question to you. We think about our ranchers in Montana as the original conservationists. They are motivated, incentivized to conserve because otherwise they can't pass the ranch on to the next generation. Could you speak to the important role that grazing plays in the ecosystem and the role that grazing can play in meeting conservation goals?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Senator. Grazing is perhaps the most effective and nimble tool that exists to address many of the concerns that the administration and frankly, many people before this administration have pointed out in Montana and across landscapes in the West. Grazing can be deployed in a very targeted manner and in a very science-based manner to address invasive species like invasive plant species, as well as playing a very important role in meeting climate goals. When you talk about carbon sequestration and grasslands, a lot of that is driven by the hoof action and by the biological processes of ruminant animals like cattle and sheep. So it is a powerful tool for carbon sequestration. It's a powerful tool for addressing invasive species. It also has those ancillary benefits that others have touched on of reducing fuel loads in both rangeland and forest ecosystems. We do have many permittees in PLC who practice silvopasture and are also grazing in more forested areas, but it's equally important on rangelands. Reducing those fine fuel loads and reducing the frequency and intensity of the wildfires that we're seeing is absolutely vital for conservation. And if I may, you touched on that need to conduct business in a sustainable manner in order to pass on the operation. That's something that we just stress time and again in our conversations with the administration, and we greatly appreciate the attention that the Western Caucus has paid to that aspect of this. You can't have sound landscape management and continuity if you're driving everyone out of business. So that extra regulatory burden is not good from an economic perspective or an ecosystem perspective.
You know, I just thinking out loud, anybody who's been out in the outdoors, and when you try to start a fire, how do you start it? You get the fuel load on the forest floor and the grasses to get it going. I mean, that's the ignition source you just talked about there. It's common sense that to think some of our colleagues don't always understand that, at least in terms of reducing risk of wildfires. Heath, what question for you? 50% of our national forests are already designated roadless or wilderness. Yet many of these area acres are in very poor health. It affects wildlife habitat, water quality, and of course, wildfire risk. Why is it important that the Biden administration promote more management of our forests, not less, in their conservation agenda?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I mean, I think the simple answer is we won't get out of this forest health problem without it. And we've seen 20 years of this playing out where it's just getting worse every year. And if anything, with warming temperatures and climate change and drought, we need to thin these forests. It's going to help with downstream water supplies. It's going to reduce the size and intensity of wildfires. And hopefully we can provide some of our own lumber here domestically and store carbon and wood products. So it really is a win-win. And we're very much hoping that the Biden administration will follow the report that the Forest Service put out, calling for an additional 20 million acres to be treated over the next 10 years. But we're not going to be able to do that with a business as usual approach. And so leaders like you in Congress who have really been urging them to pick up the pace of management, including Chair Manchin at Senate Energy and Natural Resources. We believe there's bipartisan support for this, and there's no reason not to go forward with science-based forest management.
Well said, Heath. Dan, turn over to you if you have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Senator Daines. And Daryl, I'll just throw out one thought before we open the floor up to everybody else. I wanted to, first of all, throw out the thought, being a farmer, I've always thought farmers were the original conservationists. We depend on the land and the water. Without good stewardship, that truly negatively impacts our ability to not only this generation earn a living, but for future generations. And so I think we're very conservation minded. But I wanted to, Jonathan, give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Western Conservation Principles. I know from what I know of the association, that you're kind of a grassroots organization. I'd love to hear some of the process and the input that you heard from your members on prior to taking the step of adopting the Western Conservation Principles. And let me tell you that we really appreciate the support there and the input that we got from you. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about that.
Sure, thank you, Congressman, for that. I would say that the conservation principles largely reflect the NACO platform on natural resources issues. If you go to the NACO website and pull up our American County platform, you'll find that when it comes to everything from Superfund and abandoned well cleanup to forest management, you're going to find a lot of stuff in sync between the two documents there. But within our organization, the way that that's developed is actually our individual members. We're made up of county officials, elected county commissioners and supervisors who then are appointed by their state associations of counties to make up our different steering committees, our policy steering committees that include ag, public lands, environmental issues. And so that's how our entire platform is developed. And that's all based on the experience that our individual members have had in interacting with federal agencies, particularly those county officials that are in Western states and have to deal in a hands-on way with the Forest Service or the Park Service, the EPA, or any of those other agencies. And I think that in particular, the forest management issue, just to hit on that as a prime example, because I think that's probably where we find the broadest agreement with Western Caucus and Heath and some of the other industry folks. Our members have, in many instances, taken state funding or pulled together funding from various counties to put together resource conservation plans, resource management plans within their county that they then use to really impact the NEPA process and the environmental planning process for the national forest system. And so just having that information available, which is scientific, it's on the ground, it's readily available data that the agencies can then roll into their forest management plans or into a specific project, really gives the agencies a lot more information, but also a better legal leg to stand on when they try to implement these plans. And so we've really spent the past few years, not just on 3030, but on resources issues in general, conveying that point that we're a natural ally for you. And if you listen to our members, we're going to have the voice of the community, and we're also going to have the science and data to back it up that you can really use to make better decisions.
Great. Well, we certainly appreciate that your engagement there, and I see it as a true partnership that we can really move forward some positive efforts here. So thank you very much for that, Daryl. I'll relinquish the floor and open it up to some questions.
Yeah, just a couple comments here on that. And Jonathan, appreciate your input and your continued work with us as a esteemed alumni of the Western Caucus as an executive director. No, the counties are great. We go around the country, and Chairman Newhouse knows this because we see them all the time when we do our events. We get county leaders showing up to our Western Caucus events. We go put boots on the ground and tour facilities and do our roundtables around the country. So we really appreciate their input from a local flavor of what it means to them of the federal policy issues and how they're impacting county leaders and their implementation, especially in areas like Nevada and Utah, where the federal lands percentage is so high. You know, they're so debilitated by the ability to manage their own counties. And in fact, we were in North Dakota last fall where we toured a grazing ranch doing grass-fed beef, and how they were, the ranching community in North Dakota was help restoring the depleted grasslands of the Northern Plains, and how they were using grazing as a tool to really regenerate that, that area. And I thought that was, tremendous things. One of the great things we get to do is go around the country and see this stuff. So, a number of us saw that firsthand when we were in North Dakota last fall. And it is no joke. The grazers really know how to manage their land and how to work it and bring back what has already been depleted. So pretty tremendous there. And Heath, as well as the forests, I always like to say the forests are a Department of Agriculture for a reason. They're there to be managed and a sustainable resource. So we need to treat them accordingly. Don't have any more questions. We don't have any questions on the Q&A chat, Mr. Chairman Newhouse. So I will flip it back over to you for a few last words. But I think the takeaway here is that 30 by 30 remains undefined. The Western Caucus has put out a great set of guiding principles that, the country should be looking towards of where we move in the future and how do we do conservation versus preservation. So with that, Chairman Newhouse, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Daryl. Thank you, Jonathan. You're absolutely right. And thanks for bringing that point up, Daryl. The county representation that comes to our Western Caucus events as we go throughout the West, every state we stop at, I think we have county commissioners, supervisors come. That's exactly the kind of input we need too. We want to hear from the people who, it's kind of a cliche, but literally on the ground, engaged in the local projects, the challenges that they face. That's the input we need. I just want to thank you very much for that kind of participation. It's so impactful at every place we go. So we want to keep that relationship, like I said, that partnership that we have as strong as we possibly can. So thank you, Jonathan.
With that, Mr. Chairman, unless you have any questions, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think we'll be re-airing this on our social media channels, so you'll be able to share it with other folks, and folks in the audience can share that as well. And if you haven't, please sign up and like our Facebook page, and you can see all the stuff live and recorded. So, Chairman Newhouse, our guests, our panel, thank you very much. and appreciate your input, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
There's